Show of show.
Coming through.
I'm here with the OG, aka Knowledge. How you doing, bro?
I'm good, Del. WrestleMania 1.
WrestleMania 1, told.
We're in WrestleMania season. And, yeah. This
Looking
show,
forward to it?
Nah, but I mean, I don't know. I haven't watched WrestleMania for years, to be honest with you. But, like, yeah, it's still it's the biggest show of the year in wrestling, you know? So it's always something that always creates some interest. And I mean, like, it's the history of the event is more so what I'm more interested in than actually watching the stuff nowadays. But the first WrestleMania's got a really interesting story, and you know, the first WrestleMania really set the tone for where the company is today. So yeah, wrestling in general, yeah. I mean, it started, WrestleMania really started the shift in moving from the actual pro wrestling aspect of the business to the more sports entertainment vein that we have today. At the time, people in wrestling hated it.
Yeah.
And now it's just become the norm of what to expect when watching pro wrestling. But yeah, looking forward to talking about this.
So I think where we're going to start off is who better than to start off with Vince McMahon? What can we say about Vince McMahon in relation to shifting towards WrestleMania 1?
Vince was, at this time period, Vince had just bought the company from his dad. So what happened was Vince McMahon Sr., Vince's dad, was running the New York territory. He'd run it from 1962 onwards. In the New York on the East Coast is, before then, his dad, Jess McMahon, used to promote boxing throughout New York.
Yeah.
And Vince Sr. was either the number 1 or number 2 pro wrestling promoter in America. It just depends on the time period. It's either him or Jim Crockett were the 2 top guys. Vince had the New York market, so he had the most profitable market, but Crockett had the bigger area. He had Charlotte and he had the Carolinas, and that was really, at the time, considered the hotbed of pro wrestling, was the Carolinas. But Vince was the way it worked back then was America was broken up into territories, and every single promoter had an area of the country, and no one really cross-promoted in anyone's
Do you
era.
have any examples of different territories?
Florida, you had Eddie Graham, and he had the whole state of Florida, Eddie Graham. In Texas is a big state, so that was always split up into 2 parts. So you had Fritz von Erich in one half, and then in the Dallas part, and then you had Paul Bosch from the Houston end up, and then you had Bill Watts over in Houston, and then you had Bill Watts in Louisiana and Mississippi, and then you had Vince in New York and Roy Shire in LA. You had Don Owen in Portland. You had so many different guys, and then you obviously in Canada you had the Rougeaus had Montreal, Stu Hart had Calgary, the Calgary area. So there was so many different promoters in all these different areas, and no one really ran in anyone's territory. They all worked together.
Yeah.
The NWA was the governing body, and what that meant was every promoter worked with the NWA. We had one world champion, and that champion would go around from territory to territory, and he would defend his title against that territory's top contender, usually top babyface. So if Ric Flair was your world champion, he would have a schedule, and he would have to go to Florida to wrestle Barry Windham or Dusty Rhodes. He would go to
Texas to the Von Erichs.
Von Erichs, or he would go to Louisiana to wrestle Bill Watts' top guy, whoever that was at the time, Ernie Ladd or JYD, for example. And he would go. That's just how the business was run. Now, Vince McMahon and the WWF they weren't part of the NWA. Vince had his own world title. There was 3 world titles in America at the time. You had the NWA title, you had the AWA title, which was Vernon, Minnesota, and you had Vince in New York with the WWF title. Now, they all worked in conjunction together. Even though there were 3 world titles and the NWA was the main one, there was no hostility. In fact, Vince and Vern were actually on the NWA board, so they actually helped vote for who would be the next NWA champion, as it's respected both of them were. But Vince Jr. worked for his dad. He was a commentator, and he did local promotion in the New York area and Philadelphia area. So he was there learning the business. And people knew that when Vince Sr. retired, Vince would take over. They didn't, however, know what was going to happen.
And what did happen? Let them know, because like we mentioned all these territories. And for these territories to now shift from where it was to what it became, with Vince poaching different talent from the Texases, the Floridas, from the Californias, what How did you go about doing this?
Okay, so what he did, Vince Sr. got really ill. He had cancer, and he sold the company to his son. His son agreed to pay him $250,000 every quarter for 4 quarters. That's $1 million over a space of a year.
Yeah,
and he had to keep certain people on. Gorilla Monsoon, Arnold Scarlett was another one. He agreed to keep those people on, and a few others that were loyal to Senior. And he then took over the company. Now, what people didn't know at the time, there were rumors about it. Because if you go back and you read like stuff like The Observer, back then, there was always rumors that Vince was going to do what he did. But Vince and Vince Sr. always told the other promoters that. Vince Sr. would always tell the other promoters, oh, you know, it's fine. My son, don't listen to that stuff. My son, he's going to work with you. You know, he's going to stay in New York and all that stuff. And that was not the case at all. As soon as he could, Vince Jr. started stealing talent, and he started going into these other territories, and he started running shows in these territories. But what he did, don't get me wrong, promoters had always poached talent from other places, because back then wrestlers didn't stay in one place. They worked, they had a run, and then when it was time to go, they would go to another territory. Yeah. That's just how it was. However,
why was this one so historic and so detrimental to the whole case of territories in general? Yeah, what type of names did he poach? Let's reel off the names of talents he took, because
I tell you how
this was an all-star roster at this point.
Yeah, it was an all-star roster. So I mean, when Vince took over, Bob Backlund was the world champion.
Keep going.
You know, yeah, so you had Bob Backlund as a world champion, and the other top guys, you had Sergeant Slaughter, Pat Patterson was there.
Keep going.
And you had Rocky Johnson, Tony Atlas was there, the Samoans were there, Andre was still there as well. So that was his core people. Yeah. You can't go national with those names, and you can't take over the wrestling business with those names. So one of the first things that he did was he decided that he needed to get TV in all of these markets. So there was a guy called Jim Barnett, and Jim Barnett was a very legendary figure in pro wrestling, because Jim Barnett was massive in the TV industry. He knew everybody in the TV industry. Jim Barnett was a wrestling promoter who worked for so many different promoters. He was so respected. He ran WCW in Australia for a bit, which is where he really made his name. He made WCW, World Championship Wrestling in Australia, one of the top promotions in the world, just by his promotion.
Yeah.
And at the time he went to work for Vince, he just got fired from Georgia Championship Wrestling because he was stealing money from the company. Barnett was a guy who he used to have a very extravagant lifestyle. He always had a chauffeur, always lived in a mansion. The problem was that they found out that Georgia Championship Wrestling was paying for all this stuff.
Yeah.
But he was also gay. Do you know who Rock Hudson is?
Yeah.
He was an actor, biggest actor in that time period. He was actually in a relationship with Jim Barnett.
Okay.
Yeah, so people in wrestling knew Barnett was gay because they were openly together at shows, so they kept it quiet or whatever. But he was famous, and he got fired. Vince brought him in, and he used Barnett to take over the TVs in those areas. He went to all these different territories, and he went to these TV networks. And back then, TV was free. The promoters used TV to give the TV channels a really good TV show with really good ratings, so they could sell advertising and they could sell house show tickets. Vince came in and he paid for the TV. He said, all right, I'll give you $2,000 a week if you air my show and you get rid of X promotion. And obviously the TV networks did it, and he did that for years and years and years. The promotions couldn't afford to keep up with the $2,000.
Basically payola at this point.
It's payola, and he kept doing that for years until he couldn't afford it anymore.
Yeah.
But so him and Barnett took over all these TVs in these areas, and his TV was better than these low promotions TV. His TV was done in arenas, and it was well lit, and he had all these stars. And the other promotions that were done in TV studios, you know, with old men in knitted tights, really, you know, it's like, so it was a big difference there. But and then he went around to the other territories, and he offered so much money to some of these wrestlers that they couldn't turn it down. So in Minnesota, he took Bobby Heenan, he took Gene Okerlund, he took Hulk Hogan, Jesse Ventura, Adrian Adonis. He went to the Carolinas, he took Piper, Valentine, he took Ricky Steamboat, Barry Windham from Florida, he took Mike Rotunda from Florida. He took the Junkyard Dog from Cowboy in Louisiana. He took all of these wrestlers and he created a super roster. And what he did was, when he went to these territories, he would use those guys to main event in those areas.
Yeah.
So if he went to Louisiana, Junkyard Dog would be main eventing because the people in the area were familiar with the Junkyard Dog.
Makes a lot of sense.
If he went to Carolinas, he'd headline with Valentine and Piper because they were known in the area.
Yeah.
So that's how he created his super roster, just by overpaying people. And also, he made sure they didn't wear their notice as well. He took guys and they wouldn't show up for work anymore.
Yeah.
Like, so there was no...
Guy's a villain.
So there was no doing jobs on the way out. There was nothing there. They stopped going to work. You know, he's done that with most of the guys there. Hogan was the biggest one. Hogan was the biggest star in US wrestling at that point. He just done Rocky III. He had been on TV with Cyndi Lauper. Cyndi Lauper was
just about to mention us. I wanted to mention two things to you. Cyndi Lauper and MTV. What did these two have in correlation with WrestleMania?
Cyndi Lauper was one of the original stars of MTV. She had the massive Girls Just Want to Have Fun.
Just want to have fun.
There you go. He does music.
Oh, girls just want to have...
He does music. She had the massive record. It was huge at the time. And
Captain Lou Albano was in the video.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So Lou Albano was he played her dad in the music video, and they became really close. Yeah. And her manager, he was a manager. What was his name again? Jesus, I'm embarrassed. What's the name?
Cyndi Lauper, a manager was David Wolf. Everyone knows that.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry. David Wolf was the manager, and he was a huge pro wrestling fan, like a proper big pro wrestling fan. And he got to talking. Lou Albano went back to Vince, and then Vince managed to get Cyndi Lauper at one of the Garden shows, and it got such big publicity at the time. She was so big on MTV. Her and David Wolf were so important. They managed to get Vince a special on MTV. It was the perfect time. Hogan was just come off of Rocky III. And he was famous. He was in the AW wave working for Vern. He was on Rocky III. He was doing Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. And David Wolf,
I think, didn't he take her to, was it the Grammys?
Yes.
He went to Cyndi Lauper?
Yeah, he was her bodyguard.
Yeah.
And at that time, he was so big and he was so muscular. He really stood out. It's not like nowadays where, you know, guys look like that all the time. It's like back then, guys look like that very rarely on television.
He was larger than life.
He was huge, like, especially standing next to Wolf and Lauper, who were like really short people. He looked massive. So he was really eye-catching. And Vince managed to get Hogan. And all he did to get Hogan was, because there's a story going around that Hogan wanted the AWA title. And I never really thought that was true, because Hogan had a deal with New Japan. Werner had a deal with All Japan.
Yeah.
So Hogan could have never, he earned so much money working for New Japan. That was his A job. He could have never have been AWA world champion, because then he couldn't do the New Japan tours. He'd have to go work for All Japan. So I've never really bought into that. But yeah, so when Hogan left, Vince got Hogan to leave. Hogan didn't leave notice. He just left.
Yeah.
He sent Vern a telegram. And Vern thought it was a joke.
Yeah.
He thought it was a joke. He saw this telegram and it said, "I'm not coming back to work." And he thought that it was a joke. And he went to work. He went to the show and Hogan won there. But so Vern hated Vince McMahon. We hated him with a passion. Sheik has always told this story where before the famous Garden match where Hogan won the title, Vern offered him $50,000 to break Hogan's leg in the match. Sheik never did it.
I bet he regrets it.
He probably did.
I would have done it for 20, I'll be real.
He got fired a couple of years after that. Vince always treated Sheik good. He always brought him back. He always brought him back for periods. But yeah, he turned that down. Also, there's always been this rumor. I say it's a rumor because Brody admitted it, but people have always denied it anywhere else. But the story is that Bruiser Brody was offered $50,000 to attack Mr. T as he walked to the ring at WrestleMania 1.
Yeah.
Like, which would have been crazy if it ever happened. But if Brody walked out to the ring and he attacked Mr. T, that would have ruined everything. Yeah.
What would be like the 80s version or 80s equivalent to like TMZ?
Probably the New York Post.
That would probably be front page.
Probably, yeah, that Bruiser Brody attacked Mr. T on the way to the ring, just to ruin the show. That's how much. There's also stories about Vince having hits put out on him by other promoters, but that was never confirmed. That was just talk, I guess.
I think Jim Ross even debunked that and said that.
Jim Ross said that, yeah.
He said that wasn't true.
Jim Ross has said that, but I'm sure it was discussed.
Yeah.
Because, you know, this is what they did back then.
Yeah.
Vince managed to offer him a shitload of money to be the centerpiece of his promotion, and hooked him up with Cyndi Lauper. They did The War to Settle the Score, was the first MTV pro wrestling special. Yeah. It was him and Piper in the main event. And
I know her and Cyndi and Piper had a segment where I think
that was leading up to, so that was a Madison Square Garden show where they were giving Lou Albano a gold record.
Yeah.
And Piper came out and he hit Albano over the head with the record. He kicked Cyndi Lauper. Hogan came out to save them, and that's how they solved The War to Settle the Score. And that did a 9 rating on MTV, which at the time was the biggest rating MTV had ever done. And it really set the tone for the next step, which was WrestleMania. And I can't describe, I mean, it's really hard to comprehend because nowadays, you know, with social media and everything, you know, a lot of things seem huge, but at the time, WrestleMania, it was a big deal. Because she was hot, Hogan was hot, and then they got Mr. T in.
And if I recall, I think they also had Muhammad Ali was there.
Yeah.
Liberace was there.
Yep. Mm-hmm. They got...
For you youngers that don't know who Liberace is, go and Google him.
Google Liberace.
He's a big, big deal.
Google Liberace. Muhammad Ali had just come off losing to Trevor Berbick. He was the biggest boxing star of all time. He was actually booked to do the main event, to ref the main event. However, he wasn't in a physical state to main event the show.
Yeah.
They couldn't trust him to follow the spots and do the count. So they had him on the outside, and Pat Patterson was the guy that did the run through of the match with Mr. T and everybody. So they had Pat Patterson referee the match. But Mr. T, they got Mr. T in, they got him for 200 grand, which I don't know what that would be nowadays, but at the time, that's a good amount of money. But Mr. T was the biggest star on television at the time. He was super famous. I can't compare him to anyone now because TV is so different and not as many people watch TV as they did in 1984 and 85. But Mr. T was super famous, and they managed to get him at his hottest period when he was on the A-team, and they got him in a tag match with Hogan against Piper and Orndorff. And people wonder, you know, that I think WrestleMania 1 was the only WrestleMania that didn't have a world title match.
Yeah.
And if you look at the way that they were coming up in terms of popularity, they couldn't do a world title match because they needed Mr. T in the main event. If they would have had Hogan and Piper for the world title, there wouldn't have been as much interest. Yeah. Mr. T had to be there.
I mean, in terms of like figures and stuff, like what was the attendance record like for WrestleMania? I'm guessing it might have been just over 90,000, if that.
19,000 at Madison Square Garden at the time because there was no entrance. It was just a regular walkway. But they sold the building out really quickly. The problem with WrestleMania was that the week up to WrestleMania, it wasn't looking good in terms of some of the closed circuit, because back then it was available on pay-per-view, but you had to, the majority of the country didn't have pay-per-view at the time, so you'd have to go to an arena or a cinema to watch the show. It's called closed circuit.
Yeah.
So you buy your ticket at the cinema, or you buy your ticket to the arena, and you have to watch it there. And a week before, they cancelled about 60 venues because the advances were so poor. So it was looking like a success on the East Coast, but around the country, it wasn't looking as successful. Luckily, the day before WrestleMania, they managed to get Hogan and Mr. T to host Saturday Night Live, and which was a big gig at the time. It was a massive gig. Hogan and Mr. T were the guest hosts. They did segments and skits and stuff like that. And the following day, the walk-up business for WrestleMania was huge. They did about 400,000 tickets around the country for WrestleMania. Yeah. And it was a success. They made about $6 million on that one night. And remember, that's 85. Yeah. So in 1985, $6 million is a huge amount of money. But the reason, I mean, WrestleMania at the time, you got to think there were super shows before, because Starrcade had been going for 2 years prior. Yeah. You watch Starrcade compared to WrestleMania, Starrcade is a wrestling show. You got Ric Flair bloody in the main event in a steel cage. You got really good wrestling on the undercard. WrestleMania wasn't that.
It was a variety show.
It was a variety show. You had the Rockettes, and you had Cyndi Lauper walk into the ring with Wendy Richter. Liberace was dancing. It was a circus, and people in wrestling absolutely hated it. They if you listen to interviews back then or read the interviews that some of these people in wrestling were saying, they thought it was a disgrace. Yeah. They were embarrassed by it. They said that, you know, because the wrestling was bad on the show. You had Junkyard Dog against Greg Valentine on Fit Intercon. It was a horrible match. It's like, that wasn't the only one, but there was some
two people that are actually known for their work rate as well. It makes it even worse.
It was just a bad match, and Bundy was on the show in a 9-second match. It was bad, and like, these promoters were appalled that Vince McMahon had gotten all these outsiders, and they said it was never going to work. The problem is that it did work, and it continued working, and I mean, with that one show, he changed the way pro wrestling was presented. It became, literally, that was the birth of sports entertainment. You mixed the two, that's where that term comes from. And pro wrestling changed forever because while in the NWA, those guys continued doing what they were doing. Vince McMahon, he got a cartoon show. He got toys.
Albums.
He got albums. He had albums. Jim Crockett was promoting pro wrestling. He was promoting Ric Flair cutting his head open in the WWF. They had a cartoon show, and they had Cyndi Lauper, and they had Mr. T box the next year. It's literally
night and day.
No, it's night and day. And, you had the New York promotion as well. And eventually, he got more talent. Stud came over. He got so much more talent leading up to WrestleMania 2 and 3. By the time WrestleMania 3 came along, they were out of here, Then Crockett went out of business the following year. I mean, Vince, for all the good that Vince McMahon did for himself, him taking over the territories really did stunt pro wrestling in terms of the amount of jobs that people had and stuff like that. He looked out for his company and himself, but he really did stunt the growth of pro wrestling around the country because he killed it off. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's what happened in WrestleMania 1, and look where we are today. It's, one of the biggest brands in sports from that one event in New York.
Absolutely crazy. Just before we cap things off, what's a match from that?
None. None of them. If you want to, I tell you what, the war settled the angle.
From Tuesday Night Titans?
No, if you go back and watch the angle where Piper hit Albano over the head with the record, it's great. And leading up to WrestleMania, they did a segment in New York, in Madison Square Garden, where Piper and Mr. T had this segment, and Piper was presenting him pictures of what he was going to do to him. Roddy Piper is amazing in that segment. It's really, really good. But WrestleMania 1, if you want to watch it for historical purposes, go ahead. But there's nothing on there that I can personally say you need to go out your way and watch. The interactions with Mr. T and Piper are amusing in the main event because Piper hated Mr. T. He absolutely despised him. And you could see it as well. But I wouldn't recommend anything on that show.
There you have it. WrestleMania 1. I've been Delboy. This is the OG knowledge. Wrestling for Idiots. We'll see you guys on the finale.